A historic moment and more than half a century of control, the UK has announced it will be finally handing over the strategically critical Chagos Islands, including the remote and very mysterious military crucial Diego Garcia, back to Mauritius. This isn't just a story about shifting borders, it's about decades-long power struggles, those controversial bases, and a colonial legacy that continues to impact the region. It highlights the complexities of a colonial history, but more specifically, a continued decline of the once largest global imperial empire. In this video, therefore, I explain what has just happened, why this matters, and how it reflects this rapidly evolving world order around us.
This is The Global Gambit.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Piotr, and this is The Global Gambit, a show where we look at the relationship of geopolitics, global macro, and current events, and try to understand and reimagine the West's place in this ever-changing world. And from secret Cold War dealings to contested UN rulings and accusations of human rights abuses, this story is a very complex one and quite sensitive in modern geopolitics. It raises questions about justice, restitution, and the responsibilities of former colonial powers in giving back lands that they took, and their sometimes unwillingness to do so, and the growing willingness of those once colonized to call them out on it. But before we get into some of the details and actually the main news of this moment, bit of historical context. To understand why this is so significant, we need to look back at the 1960s, when the Chagos archipelago became part of what was now known as the British Indian Ocean Territory, or BIOT. At the time, the UK separated islands from Mauritius in 1965, a few years before Mauritius gained its own independence from the UK in 1968. This was the last colony established by the UK, and one with a very controversial history to it. As part of this secret deal, the UK agreed to lease Diego Garcia, the largest and southernmost atoll in the archipelago, to the US for use as a military base. This arrangement was crucial for the US-UK ties during the Cold War and highlighted the intertwining of their military interests and governance, but also just their particularly unique, or as the UK likes to emphasize, special relationship, and how the two were working at a level of closeness that not many other countries do. The local Chagossian population, which was around 1,000 at the time, were forcibly removed between 1967 and 1973 under orders to clear the island. Many Chagossians described living, quote, happy lives, enjoying a close-knit community and connection to their ancestral homelands. They were relocated to Mauritius and neighbouring Seychelles, where they faced immense challenges in trying to reconstruct their lives. A 1966 Foreign Office memo, for example, described the UK's intents as, quote, to get some rocks which will remain ours. There will be no indigenous population except seagulls. This document reflects the callousness, I think, with which the colonial powers often approached certain indigenous populations, treating them as expendable, as disposable in the pursuit of larger-scale strategic interests. Over the decades, the displaced Chagossians fought in British and international courts to return to the homelands that they inhabited, but with little success, reflecting the continued struggles of many post-colonial nations seeking justice. Now, to put this into modern-day terms, the BBC and a few other outlets reported that a historical, or what has been called a historical move, or shameful in the eyes of Grant Shapps, a recently departed part of the UK Tory government, that the UK has agreed to transfer the sovereignty of these islands to Mauritius, ending more than the 50 years of disputed claims. The announcement was made in a joint statement between UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Mauritian Prime Minister Pravind Jugnauth, who was also and was welcomed. This entire development was welcomed by US President Joe Biden as a diplomatic win that, quote, overcomes long-standing challenges and to reach peaceful and mutual beneficial outcomes. However, I think the statement also raises questions about the implications for the Chagossians themselves. The agreement will keep the critical UK-US base on Diego Garcia operational for a period of 99 years, a key concession that made this entire deal possible and illustrates that the UK and US are willing to make agreements as long as what they need most critically, nothing changes. For example, Washington, this is a base where, well, it's a linchpin in their global defense strategy. It's located about halfway between East Africa and Indonesia. It provides critical support for US naval ships and long-range bomber aircraft, playing a vital role in monitoring strategic choke points and conducting refueling operations for aircraft missions. no more notable than during the War on Terror, where it served as a launch pad for bombing campaigns in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and continues to be one of the very few places where the US can actually reload its submarines with Tomahawk missiles. Also, given its remoteness in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it's very hard for potential adversaries to really strike it without it being obvious where they're going and to be monitored and found out before actually being able to strike Diego Garcia. But it's not just a security deal. I do want to emphasize that it's about reparations and its rights for the Chagossians. The UK has, interestingly, promised a package of financial support to Mauritius, including annual payments and infrastructure investment. The Mauritian government will begin a program of resettlement on some of the outer islands. However, Diego Garcia itself, as we said, will remain off limits for at least the next century, a decision that has still angered many of the local communities who feel their voices are still being ignored in discussions about the future. The exclusion has prompted ongoing debates about whether true justice has actually been achieved, without acknowledging the deep-seated historical injustices that the communities face. Now, for the latter part of this video, I do want to focus on why it matters from a few different angles and what it could mean going forward in sort of a couple of different ways. So on the surface, it's a story of this small island being handed over, but it does have far-reaching implications in terms of global power dynamics, human rights, but also how it might embolden countries where this base and the islands, the atoll, is particularly, well, why it's being so sort of has been fought over and disputed for so long. Now, from a geopolitical perspective, one major reason that it comes is because it reflects the increasingly public pressure from the global south, specifically the African continent, who largely spoke in unison on this matter. They really got behind the Mauritians to help them pressure the British to relent and give up the islands. And more than ever, that the colonized countries are feeling justified and emboldened to challenge the legacy or colonialist powers in ways which we haven't really seen even in the past 10 or 15, 20 years. Moreover, as I've said, Diego Garcia is not just an island. It's one of the world's most important secure military bases, and it provides the US and its allies with a unique outpost in the Indian Ocean, which no other country or entity really has that can be used in such a way. As the tensions rise, specifically between Western countries, India and the more assertive China, under President Xi and its wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's called in the West, maintaining control of this base is, I don't think I can underline how important it is. So while it lasts for 99 years, it still means the US can hold a critical location despite it being thousands of miles away from the US home. And you need that whenever you're considering long-term military and strategic operations. But will it remain the case if regional powers dynamic shifts, for example? Well, China is expanding its influence in the Indian Ocean through infrastructure projects like the BRI and increased military presence through its patrolling. It has its position in Djibouti, for example. And so the role of Diego Garcia as a way to counterbalance against that really, underlines the US and UK's approach to sort of their defense strategies, but also towards countering the Chinese. Now on to the, shall we say, the human rights element. For Mauritius, this is a culmination of decades of legal battles and diplomatic pressure. After all, the UN's top court ruled in 2019 that the UK's administration of the territory was, quote, unlawful, and called for the islands to be handed back to complete the decolonisation process. Human Rights Watch, a well-known advocacy group, has called the eviction of the Chagossians and their continued exclusion a, quote, colonial crime that amounts to persecution. Despite the progress, many still feel that, again, it's not enough. Some Chagossians calling it, quote, a betrayal that still leaves them without a voice in determining their future. And the deal also underscores the challenge of reconciling, I think, historical injustices with contemporary geopolitical realities. Namely speaking, that, unfortunately, when push comes to shove, security and strategic interests often come above human rights and sort of commitment to, what we would consider to be altruistic norms and values. The West does this as much as anyone else, and I think we need to keep that in mind. So when we promise all sorts of things about the restoration of X, Y, or Z, if it compromises the security of certain assets, then that may well not actually happen, despite the words being made or the promises being made. The third thing I think is really important for why this matters or where it could go or the future is of other British territories. It's a handover raises questions about the UK's 14 remaining territories, including the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar, where local populations are protective, actually, of their British ties. The UK stepping back from Chagos is, in the minds of some, a dangerous precedent because it will normalise or legitimise the need for these territories to be returned as well. Interestingly enough, the governor of the Falklands quickly issued a statement saying that the UK's was, quote, unwavering commitment to defend the UK's sovereignty remains undiminished. Specifically, therefore, making it very clear that whilst this has happened with Biot, it's not going to happen with the Falklands. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that the British government did hold a poll in 2013 to see whether the inhabitants of the Falklands wanted to remain under British governance or be transferred to Argentinian. And bar only 2 people who voted against, everyone else, more than 99%, voted to stay under British command. So the situation is still, though, I think, a reflection of the growing desire for smaller territories to seek more autonomy or full-blown independence. And though it's rather unlikely, given the unique relations and proximity with Gibraltar, you're going to continue, I think, to see pressure between the Spanish and the British over that area as well. Finally, I want to focus on the US-UK relations, which is, well, this isn't going to transform these two. It is a reminder of the deep and sometimes uneasy military relationship between any countries, including the US and the UK. While the UK maintains the nominal control of the archipelago, Diego Garcia has almost been entirely under US command. For example, when the BBC tried to access the island, UK officials actually deferred to US staff, highlighting the rather bizarre, really, power dynamics here. And with the lease set to expire in 2036 for the Americans, future negotiations between the British and the Americans are going to have to, continue or restart. And they could become a flashpoint given this new reality that has just developed, although things seem relatively smooth at the moment. The evolving relationship between the US, the UK, and their broader partners, I think, in the context of this multipolar or just unpredictable world is I think only going to challenge it, but ultimately I don't see that being too much potentially of a major issue. Overall, this handover, I think, marks the end of one of the UK's last major holdings, and by far, again, a reflection of a country that has gone from somewhere where the sun never sets to, well, I think a lot of the Suez Crisis in 1956, and how after the reality was discovered by the Americans, it became very clear that the British, particularly, as well as the French to a less extent, could not really undertake their own foreign policy without seeking the green light or sort of input of the Americans. You can see that even in recent news with the desire by the British government to allow the Ukrainians to use the Storm Shadow missiles in Russia to strike strategic sites. But the Americans have talked the British government down. So even though they are British missiles, the Americans still have a sort of seemingly underlying influence in that decision-making. But this overall video talks about many things, from colonialism to human rights to the geopolitical ramifications. I appreciate if you found it interesting. It certainly was when I came across it, and I look forward to seeing what you think in the comments. Appreciate you watching, and if you did enjoy it, then consider subscribing for more content like this, where I try to look out for more interesting stories and provide you with a synopsis and a breakdown, and sometimes my own analysis. But as always, I wish you a peace of mind. I'll see you all next time. Take care.